right away. So in that sense, Wahhabism and Puritanism, Puritanist orientations generally, they raised a very attractive sign, a sign of what we are. We have the guts to think in new ways and in new paradigms and to come up with new solutions. But in doing so, what you discover they ended up doing is that they threw out everything that could have been useful to Muslims, everything that resembled ethical rootedness, the moral paradigms of Islam, and basically give themselves a green light, a license to do with the Islamic tradition, to reconstruct, to rephrase, to reassert the Islamic tradition as they wish. The problem is if the agent is flawed, ignorant, psychotic, immoral, what they produce will also be the same way.
Well, that gets to the idea of that this opening the gates of ijtihad or promiscuous use of ijtihad interpretation by unqualified specialists can lead not always to some very good conclusions. One of the people who is seen as one of the main sources of modern day Islamic radical thinking, who is perhaps one of the sources of inspiration together with Wahhabist ideology for Osama bin Laden, is Sayyid Qutb.
Right. Yeah.
And he also advocated the ability now to reinterpret or to interpret things in a particular light. Major ideologue for radicals today. How did he abuse this, and how did he justify violence and even terror?
Sayyid Qutb is a good point in case, because Sayyid Qutb, number one, he was not in any way trained jurist. He was a literary critic. That's actually his specialty, literary criticism. And interestingly, in Sayyid Qutb, his life can be divided into two parts. The first part of his life, or the first half, as a literary critic, he was actually quite good. And many of the things he wrote were rich and informative. And in other words, when he spoke about what he actually knew something about, art, he actually said things that were intelligent and powerful. Sayyid Qutb goes through what everyone acknowledges as a severe emotional, but I believe it was also a religious upheaval when he is tortured. And he was arrested and tortured during the Nasser regime, and confronting the viciousness of the torture hoisted upon him, he writes that he came he had an epiphany, so to speak, that the people who were doing this to him could not possibly be real Muslims. Now, this is a psychological attitude. I mean, this is a problem when, not only when you don't have training, but when people develop doctrines under conditions of extreme stress. Theology and law needs a level of tranquility and repose to develop in a healthy fashion. Sort of pup law and pup theology, sort of theology or law that's shooting from the hip under extremely stressful conditions. And that's why in the Islamic tradition, jurists were actually prohibited from giving, and judges as well, from issuing an opinion or deciding anything if they were under any type of financial or emotional or any type of influence. Constantly they were told that in order to come out with something that will affect the way people live, you must be in a state of repose and peace with yourself and with God and with society. Sayyid Qutb, when he wrote Milestones in the Road, this famous treatise, was not in such a state, and eventually he's executed. And even when he, as he was in the final steps before he was executed, he would not forgive his executors and even curse them. And he said, I curse you and all the people of the poor, and so on. Now, it is up to God to judge us, not up to me. But to say the least, the man was going through some severe trials and tribulations, and who knows. And what he wrote in Milestones in the Road was very different from what he wrote earlier in more peaceful times in his life. And who knows what if he was given a chance to be safe and tranquil and reconnect with society and reconnect with God, what he would have said. But it is very dangerous to, again, the sort of opportunistic part of this, the exploitative part, is here someone who's not a jurist. He really has not trained into the mechanics of ijtihad or law or anything. And yet, he knows that he's going to say something that is fundamentally at odds with the balance of the Islamic tradition. That's why the exploitation of the notion of ijtihad. If they were not going against the grain of the Islamic tradition, they wouldn't need it. So he, in a very exploitative fashion, he invokes the idea of ijtihad and saying, well, I'm going to say something. I know that it's very different and it's unprecedented, but I'm exercising ijtihad. Some Muslims, unfortunately, are deceived. Again, the failure to look at history, the failure to look at context, the failure to look at nuance, the failure to say this is, number one, is not qualified to exercise ijtihad. Number two, is a person under extreme stress and duress, and you can't build your relationship in this life and the hereafter on the basis of that. Number three, that even when he said that what he is saying is unprecedented, in fact, it was precedented, because what he said was not that different from what the Khawarij said and the Karamita said and every other fanatic, puritanical group which were thoroughly condemned said. And so it's the Prophet has, there's a tradition in which a Prophet says that he's asked whether when people convert to Islam, they become good human beings or not. And the Prophet says, no, those who are good human beings can become better human beings, and those who are bad human beings can become even worse human beings. And of course, this is one of the traditions that Wahhabis don't like to cite, and because it's not black and white, it's not simplistic, it's not dichotomous. It calls upon people to really reflect. But to me, this tradition pretty much captures the whole thing. It's what are your ethical and moral foundations before you engage in the shortcut of claiming religious authority.
Speaking change tape.
Sorry. Boy, that was great. I've got only two more questions. And that was a good segue.
Yeah.
I'm next going
I couldn't hear anything that made it because I didn't think it was going.
I couldn't hear through that door.
refer to your, if I may, your discussion with Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, and maybe contrast his understanding of martyrdom operations with your understanding, but also with that of the classical understanding, of the traditional understanding.
And actually, I should, because I find Qaradawi, although
We're rolling.
We're going?
Yes.
Oh,
Dr. Abu al-Fadl, I'd like to turn to, for a moment, to what most in the West refer to as suicide bombing, and which many in the Muslim world call martyrdom operations. Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, an Al-Azhar trained scholar who was expelled from Egypt for his association with the Muslim Brotherhood, is really quite popular in the Middle East and teaches and broadcasts his message via multiple means of mass communication. On several occasions, he has juridically justified these martyrdom operations under certain circumstances. You met and discussed the issue with Sheikh Qaradawi back in 2002 in Doha. Since most of the persons who commit this act are not insane, from what we know, can you explain the rationale in Islamic terms and what factors facilitate people who do this into buying into the whole project? And then tell me a little bit, what are the differences between your understanding and that of Sheikh Qaradawi?
now let me start with the second half first. I mean, Sheikh Qaradawi, it has to be understood that Sheikh Qaradawi's discourse on politics is one side of him, but the other sides are his discourse on economic issues, on women, on Christians, Jews, and so on. And interestingly enough, he is actually a person who the Wahhabis despise, because his politics is very different from his jurisprudence. So jurisprudentially, he tends to be more moderate than Wahhabis. I mean, I wouldn't say he's the beacon of moderation, but he tends to be more moderate than many, especially on issues that have to do with women and the like. And so Qaradawi's popularity, often people just collapse the notion, Qaradawi's popularity arises out of the fact that people could agree with him and do agree with him on their minds overlap over all types of different issues, and so his view on suicide bombing is not necessarily a majority position, but he is admired even by people who disagree with him. And so, and I don't. He's not a joker, and he's not like Bin Laden, a computer scientist or engineer, or like Ayman al-Zawahiri, a medical doctor or whatever. So, you can get into substantive discussions about jurisprudence with him. His position on suicide bombing, though, I saw as rather symptomatic of the Muslim predicament of people with a certain degree of popularity. They start struggling with political issues, believing that they can actually have that their opinion ought to have some weight and authority, but again, we're living in a world increasingly where specialization and extensive knowledge of issues is required. So, for instance, one of the things that it struck me is in this debate in Qatar is that he insisted, because I took him to task on, well, are you saying that indiscriminate attacks are legal? And he said no. I said, are you saying that all these prophetic traditions that say you cannot kill children or non-combatants are not valid? And he said no. So what are you saying? So he ultimately said, well, suicide attacks that are only allowed against Israel, because he condemned the attacks against, because I asked him in public on point, you know, do you support the attack on the American warship in Yemen? He said no. Do you support the attacks on the embassies in Ethiopia and so on? He said no. So he said, well, Israel is a particular case. And here,
And all Israelis?
well, that is the point. Then, okay, what is the juristic basis for that? That seems to me like an emotional position. You don't like Israelis. And as I said, I think Qaradawi has really never met Israelis and hasn't even met many Jews in his life. They haven't really dealt with them. Very much like a lot of Israelis who think of Arabs as monsters and, you know, people with tails and horns. His experiences allowed him this type of distance and demonizing of. But it's an emotional position and not a legal one, because okay, what basis do you have for saying that you can, this is valid, that suddenly the laws, ethical laws and laws of morality and rules of law are suspended when we deal with Israelis, and they kick in when we deal with everyone else?
Well, hasn't he justified it by saying that Muslims have been thrown out of their homes and chased out of their, deprived of their security, basically?
Right. He said, well, one is that the victimization of Palestinians. Second, that all Israeli civilians serve in the military and so on. But like a lot of arguments arise out of political expediency, they fall into the problem of slippery slope. You know, eventually you can come up with the same type of political narrative in situations that do not involve Israel. I mean, if you're Bin Laden and you're listening to this, you could very well say, well, you know, Israelis are actually the real actors are the Americans, because they're the ones that support Israel, and so everyone, every American pays taxes, so they're all complicit, and eventually, I mean, I noticed in the past couple of years, Qaradawi, in his program on Al Jazeera, has pretended that he has never endorsed or condoned suicide attacks, because what actually happened is, as I told him would happen, is that Palestinians themselves discovered that by acting in this unethical fashion, they've alienated many supporters. They ultimately hurt their own cause. That you cannot make and you cannot win an ethical victory or a moral victory by acting unethically or immorally. That sometimes, in order to win, that the ethical confrontation is far important than the political one, and sometimes in order to win the ethical confrontation, you need to accept becoming a victim and demonstrating, testifying as to shahada, testifying as to truth, as to justice, through victimhood, through your suffering, rather than your ability to cause suffering. And this is quite, quite clear when the Quran says, "Do not let the injustice of other lead you into injustice," or those who bear testimony against them, even against themselves or against their own parents or against their own tribe. In other words, that there are moral objectives that are higher than any political expediency or any lineages and so on. And that, all of these points were made to Qaradawi. And what I found very interesting is that Qaradawi himself in Al Jazeera starts backpedaling from his, he never came out explicitly and said, I was wrong. But
Al-Hayat?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And so, but the whole there's one criticism of suicide bombing that I don't think actually is the real criticism or the effective criticism, and that is you're committing suicide. In many ways, those who go to battle accept the possibility of dying, and in many ways they are accepting the possibility of
Sacrifice.
suicide. Yeah. So I don't think that, but we have to, in suicide bombing, confront the issue of that you're attacking by stealth and acting in ways that are indiscriminate and could quite be disproportionate. And here again, it's I always feel that for a jurist and for a theologian, both, you either stand by moral principle or you accept the possibility that political expediency can create all types of moral exceptions. And I believe, as a Muslim, as a theologian, as a jurist, that the way of political expediency is the way of the devil. Then there is no, then you don't offer anything as a religious person anymore. If you're really willing to compromise everything to win something in this temporal world, then might as well, then we don't need your perspective, your theological perspective, because there are a lot of people willing to do this. Even the devil himself is willing to do this. Willing to say, yeah, let's worry about political expediency. And here it's really, is your loyalty ultimately, and I know that it's hard for a lot of Muslims to hear it in this rather harsh fashion, but is your loyalty ultimately to the territory of Palestine or to the principles of Islam, the ethics? And I think that you never, if you truly believe in the hereafter and in God and in the totality of ethics that Islam is supposed to stand for, the answer has to be quite clear, and you must believe that at the end, the ethical position is the superior position. And that is a fundamental, I think, difference that I find in my many debates with Puritans and so on, is that ultimately those who open the door of ethical compromise end up using the idea of necessity. Well, this is a necessity, but the necessity can unravel every ethics in the
Pandora's
world.
box.
Yeah,
Pandora's
Pandora's
box.
box to
Yeah.
immorality. I've got to, and ultimately, there have been several attempts. I've sort of in debates I've told people, do you know your logic ultimately will justify even killing a Muslim jurist and a Muslim theologian who worships the same God, because ultimately you will follow these sort of mechanical, logical steps until you get to the point, well, that life is dispensable as well. And we saw it in the assassination, the murder of the rector of Azhar, Sheikh Dhahabi, by one of these groups. But I myself have been targeted in several of these attempts, and I find it speaks volumes that you're unable to respond at the level of Islamic theology or at the level of Islamic law, or even at the level of reason, rational engagement and discussion, and ultimately you find yourself pushed towards the ugly act, towards violence, to try to decisively end the conversation. To win, right. And I think that in itself speaks volumes. But I really think that particularly for the people who interact with Muslims, and especially when they're military, it is so critical to people a lot of times say, well, how do we understand Muslims? And I say, well, understand them just as human beings. They just the same emotions you have within your family, same emotions of individual emotions, collective emotions, the family emotions, emotions that as a member of a town or a neighborhood and so on, they're all the same, identical. Before being Muslim, they're human, thoroughly human. And then second is to fully understand that the likelihood that any Muslim you're dealing with, especially in Iraq or Afghanistan, is going to end up dying or being maimed, end up being a victim of the radicals, violence by radicals, is so high. It's much higher than the possibility of you yourself as a military person ending up being a victim of the same violence. And I think that fundamentally should affect your attitude and your whole orientation towards the people you deal with. You're dealing with people who, some of them could potentially develop enough grievances to fall prey to the radicals. So you don't contribute to the problem by causing emotional scars.
Mhm.
You actually solve the problem by healing emotional scars. And I think that's a huge difference between military presence of American forces in Muslim countries and a hostile takeover, if you will, where you go in as a conqueror.
Mhm.
Your first war is about hearts and minds, not about what building or what street you really control.
So then, in closing, since you bring it all back into focus now with what we do in terms of military operations, we've got people, military folks of all branches on the ground throughout the Middle East. We're actively engaged in counterinsurgency operations in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We're working at diplomatic levels. We're working liaisoning with religious leaders, engaging with religious leaders, and understanding their power to mobilize their communities of faith. We're trying to do reconstruction and stabilization. We're working with Loya Jirgas in Afghanistan, and with the Majlis and the folks, the Shuratic model in Iraq, and also dealing with folks in a variety of other places too. We do a variety of things in the military, and yet we are coming up against different groups of people who appear to be highly motivated to attack not only our forces, to destroy what we are trying to help them, or some people in the society, rebuild, but also attacking their own people, those who would be our allies, who want to try to establish perhaps an authentically Afghan or Iraqi state, not a copy of the United States of America.
Right.
What is it that our commanders, our civil affairs people, what is it that they need to keep in mind when they encounter something, or people, or shayukh leaders who are using religion to mobilize their communities in such a way to cause them to act aggressively?
Well, it's very important there's several things. I mean, one is that there has to be the realization that if they didn't use religion, they would have as easily used something else. Tribal identity, Arab pride, nationalism, the flag, whatever it is. I mean, it's not in the same way you have many religious Muslims on your side. You have people who could be religious against you. That is Religion is a relationship between a person and their God, and like all types of worldviews, if you will, or normative ways of thinking that say you ought to